what Roger didn't mention is that this is, without a doubt, the first and most important, this conference is the most important conference I attend every year, most important intellectual conference I attend every year. And I'll tell you honestly what excites me about it is that even though it has a theme, it never has an agenda. And that's who Roger is. He is honestly the most courageous intellectual I know, because he is never offended by disagreement. He values disagreement. As he said, you know, we've been friends for 25 years, I think, and I've really learned a lot from him. The other thing I would really like to acknowledge is the staff of the Arendt Center, especially Tina Stanton. She is an exemplary person. She's, over the years, become a dear friend, and she, yeah, please give her an applause. Yeah. And I cherish this institution, Bard, just because it's open to eccentric thought. You know, I myself went to a liberal arts school, and we both taught at a liberal arts school, and you know, this is a place I've often recommended very, very bright students to come to. So I'm delighted to be here. As Roger just said, over the last year, we've gone on many walks around Central Park. And in the course of that time, this issue of tribalism and cosmopolitanism has often come up, especially in the context of what's happening in Gaza and the Middle East. And I think it would be right to say we don't disagree. We just put the emphasis on different parts of the situation. He thinks of himself as a tribalist who aspires to be a cosmopolitan. I think of myself as a cosmopolitan who wants to animate what I recognize are my tribal instincts. So with that in mind, let me proceed. The modalities of tribalism and cosmopolitanism are quite distinct, though in important ways they overlap. They also offer different kinds of solace and challenges. Covenant is at the heart of tribalism, just as contract is at the heart of cosmopolitanism. Tribalism asks the following sort of questions. Do human beings have souls? Which group, where does my identity come from? Which group was I born into? Which tribe was I born into? What is the relationship of, what is my standing in my tribe? What is the relationship between my tribe and other tribes? And because tribes live in they ask the same kind of questions, but they come up with different answers. And that fact that they're in the same space often leads them to live close to issues of life and death. And that's why I think they are often in conflict. Different tribes offer different answers to the same sort of questions. And or rather I should say, different tribes ask the same sort of questions, and they often come up with different answers. And because they do, at least in some cases, tribes are suspicious of each other. And often this leads to war. Tribalism lives close to matters of life and death. Such questions do not lead to inflexible answers. As Harold Lasky said, nationalism, which along with families and religion is perhaps the most pervasive form of modern tribalism, nationalism has stiff joints. Tribal identities are embedded in larger stories, just as typically national stories are. Nations tell themselves stories about who they are, and they tell others more or less similar stories. Cotton Mather's famous sermon on the deck of the Arabella made the often quoted reference to the shining city on the hill. That idea has become part of America's founding self-conception. Other countries have different founding stories. Some are grounded in divine ordinance, others tell stories about their ethnicity, yet others tell story about their genealogy from from kings and queens. They are all grounded in what might be called metaphysical. These questions all have a kind of metaphysical quality. Metaphysical not in the sense in which pragmatist philosophers often think of the term metaphysical, as a game without rules. That's how pragmatists think about metaphysics. Instead, the way in which tribalists use the term, or instead my sense of why the questions tribalists ask is almost the opposite. It's metaphysics in the sense that it prescribes origin stories that have strict rules within a defined structure. And variants of these rules get reused and reused. The rules tend to be complex, the structures tend to be complex, and I think that's why generations of anthropologists have worked on those rules and those structures. Some might say it's the mainstay of modern anthropology. The covenant, which I think is at the root of tribal formation, is a kind of passport. It's a ritual that recapitulates the big metaphysical story. They are often linked to distinct kinds of dress, like the hijab or the yarmulke, having particular names, or these days in the United States, wearing a red MAGA baseball cap, or the Nazi salute. One must be identifiable as a member of a tribe. But occasionally, what is distinctive about a tribe is its invisibility, its kind of secrecy. The very fact that membership is only known to a select group, so that others don't know who is a member of this tribe. I'm told that one of the things intelligence agencies do when they try and recruit somebody is see if she or he stand out from where they'll be working. And in some cases, if they stand out, that's a mark against them, because spies are not meant to be easily identifiable. Another thing that makes tribes exclusive is that they have exclusive passes to go to certain areas. Now, think what I just said. They're like passports. You know, you can't enter certain spaces without having that passport. Think of a temple, think of a synagogue, think of even a nation. These are all places that require some kind of rule for entry. Covenants are important because they're associated with transformations. Baptism, communions, bat and bar mitzvahs, among upper caste Hindus, the thread ceremony, among various religions, circumcision, amongst various groups of people, tattoos. The list could easily be extended. They are all rituals that manifest transformation. They are, in effect, stigmata, which indicate a kind of transformation in a person through which they become members of a tribe. Because, and why is that? Because more than anything else, tribes are about identity. They are a kind of response to the question, who are you? What makes you different from the rest of society? And because they have this architecture, questions of fairness, tribes tend to be indifferent to questions of fairness. Or rather, I should say, questions of fairness are secondary to tribes. They only come in once you've established that you're a member of this tribe. So tribal identity is the starting point. Everything else follows from that. They are kind of ontological markers. They foreclose on certain kinds of questions, and they replace them with an announcement of, this is who I am. So while other ways of thinking ask the question, is this good for me? They ask basically utilitarian questions. Tribal thinking is the opposite. It asks, are you a member of this group? And that question displaces other questions. So, just to repeat myself, the covenant is, above all else, the marker of identity. It indicates the process by which you and I come together to form a we. Covenants, just to repeat myself, transform those who are parts of a tribe. In contrast, social contract, in contrast, the social contract tradition, which in the modern world is the philosophical core of cosmopolitanism, takes people as they appear. It does not require transforming them other than by getting them to abide by rules of the association, which themselves are agreed on. As I said at the outset, contracts are about interests, which after all are negotiable. Interests can be divided. Each contract specifies the conditions that have to be met and when they have to be met. In its idealized form, parties agree or they disagree. In that sense, again in an idealized rendering, they are entirely voluntary in a way in which being a member of a tribe is not voluntary. You're given an identity before you even choose it. So, contracts assume the parties are sovereign, whether they're groups, whether they're individuals, or professional associations, or a nation. These are entirely, that is, they're entirely who they wish to be. So there's no part of them that's left out. They have no prior obligations. Their identity is fully given to them. And because of that, we can contract with different groups. So one can have a group of doctors, a group of museum goers, possibly even a group of single women who happen to love cats. And each of these groups can have other associations. They can have regional versions of themselves, national versions of themselves, international versions of themselves. Nothing is just given for these groups. There are no mysterious stories in the formation of groups. You don't have to accept, that Christ was born through immaculate conception, or that he was reborn, or that the Prophet Muhammad was illiterate and he received the word of God despite being illiterate. Similarly, you don't have to believe in the many mysteries of Hinduism. There are mysterious reasons why in Hinduism we have the caste structure. You don't have to believe any of that stuff. So cosmopolitans avoid these kind of metaphysical questions. Their glue is shared interests. Organizations can change when the interests of members change. So some organizations just die. The Organization of African States, I don't know if it still exists. When I was a young boy, it matters a lot. Similarly, the non-alignment movement. In my childhood, since India was a non-aligned country, it mattered. Now I don't hear about it. The point I'm making is that associations are voluntary. Just to repeat myself, there can be associations of doctors. And they can be associations of human beings, which is the sort of thing that underlies things like the Human Rights Convention or the Association Against Torture. Now, of course, the entry conditions for being a doctor are significantly higher than being a human being. One's just born a human being. One is not born a doctor. One has to go to medical school, do a residency, etc. So those are higher conditions. But these other kinds of association, they have lower entry bars. And they, other than being human, they don't require any credentials. It is not that members of these associations don't have views on metaphysical questions. They do. Sometimes they even have strong views. But they are not mandatory views, because they too are chosen. So you could imagine a devout Christian not believing that the world was created in 5 days, but still believing in the doctrine of Trinity. So an analogy that often comes to my mind is that there are people who believe that, as Wittgenstein did, that language has to be taken in one big gulp. So this is his idea of language as being a kind of family game or something. Now, there are people who have a different view of language, who are very competent at languages. So for some people, language is not a altogether coherent thing where you have to take it in all. Some people think of language as a bunch of rules. You're proficient in one set of rules that allows you to make certain kinds of sentences. You can modify those rules and you can make different sentences without having to take the whole thing in. So the contract people can actually have the same views as the tribalists. But they hold those views in a different way. They recognize that those views are chosen. They are not just given. A world in which choice goes all the way down can be lonely, tepid, and unsafe, because it doesn't give you that security that I'm standing on firm ground. It may feel like I'm in a house where I'm allowed to choose which color the walls should be, what kind of decoration should be, what kind of furniture there should be. But if you know that house doesn't have foundations, you can't feel safe in that house, because you know that the next storm could wipe you away. Those who choose to live in such houses without foundations, they live with risks. Perhaps they like living with those risks. But that does not mean that their lives are shallow and meaningless. Depth, after all, can be chosen. It can be made up of different things. It doesn't require a foundation. If you think of depth as a kind of vocabulary, the richness of a vocabulary, for example, I love Chopin's music, especially the nocturnes. It gives me a sense of the infinite. It's possibly my favorite composer. That's not quite true. I like Bach's suites for unaccompanied cello, especially when played by Pablo Casals. But, you know, when I listen to them, they give me a sense of depth. So the point I'm making is that I think the richness of life is substantially constituted through choice. Yesterday at lunch, Roger and I were speaking, and he asked the question, if I couldn't live in America, where would I go? And I said, possibly India, possibly England. And Roger said, oh, so you feel patriotic for India, which is the country I'm from. So you would be prepared to die for India? I just replied, no. No, I just would go to India because of prior familiarity. I'm familiar with those smells, those streets, those sounds, and they mean something to me. So the point I'm making is that Khaled was making this point yesterday through the notion of tradition, that the contrast between tribalism and cosmopolitanism misses this intervening term, what he called tradition. I think it means, it similarly misses other terms like familiarity. And familiarity, one can invest in it. It can be a form of deepness. So let me come back to something I said right at the beginning of my talk. I said tribalism and cosmopolitanism offered different solaces and challenges. I want to come back to that point. When I think of tribalism, I think the challenge of tribalism is, and the solace, the solace that tribalism gives is too much is given to you. Too much is prevenient to your existence. And similarly, it is a challenge to make something of that which is given to you. Similarly, cosmopolitanism, as I said, can feel tepid and cold. And because of that, it can often feel rootless. I grew up in a family where my mother didn't want us to be rootless. But the way in which she tried to secure that was by giving us a sense of our own value. It didn't require believing in anything. It certainly didn't require believing in Hinduism. Similarly, I have a deep, deep investment in our ancestral home. I don't think of that as a tribal investment. It's a kind of familiarity. I'm at home there. That's where I'd like to end. So again, to come back to my long-standing conversation with Roger, I actually don't think we're that far apart. We put the accent on different parts of our disagreement. Thank you.
You need your water? It's over by the, Phil's going to bring it to you. So thank you very much, Uday. Always learn so much listening to you talk and think. We don't have a whole lot of time, and there's so much I want to talk about. Let me just say that I love the way Uday thinks with clarity about the tribalism as a covenant, and as a covenant, something that is exclusive, and as something that is a covenant and exclusive, something that requires a kind of transformation. And you gave some examples, the threading ceremony, right? Bar and bat mitzvahs, baptism maybe, or confirmation. I mean, I think it's not something to forget that there are rituals of becoming an adult in most tribes. And there may not be that in cosmopolitanism. I wonder if there is one. I know that that's something that Sebastian Junger mentioned as well yesterday, is that, being asked to become an adult is actually something that is part of a kind of depth or meaning. And so all of which I think is really helpful. And then you contrast that with cosmopolitanism based on contract. which takes people as a peer. They don't need to transform into it. It's voluntary. It can be cold and rootless. And yet, and this is the challenge that Uday is here making, and I find it particularly challenging, which is to say that that's not shallow, right? That there's a depth to cosmopolitanism.
Oh, they can be.
It can be. Yeah, it can be. Okay. So I want to ask about that. I want you to tell me about the depth of cosmopolitanism. And I'm going to frame the question in two ways. Mm-hmm. One is, you talk about how you would maybe go back to India because it's familiar, and you know the smells and the taste and the food. We all know the stereotype of the cosmopolitan who likes to eat at an Indian restaurant and an Afghan restaurant and a Jewish restaurant, or a Palestinian restaurant, but knows nothing about Jewish or Afghani or Indian or Palestinian culture. It strikes me that familiarity is not enough for depth. One needs to I don't think, again, I can't tell you what your experience of India is, but I can't just be that it smells good. Or maybe it is, but I think there's, you said a home.
Yeah.
A home is not, I think there has to be more than that. There has to be something, and that's what I'm asking about. And so here's the harder part of the question for me to frame, because I'm asking you about something you know a lot more about than I do. Your second book, which has won too many awards to mention and which I think is brilliant, is called Liberalism and Empire. And in that book, you argue that liberalism is imperial insofar as that it only gives freedoms, the liberal freedoms, to those who are educated into being good liberal citizens. Yeah. It seems to me that what you do with liberalism is show its tribalism. Yeah. It strikes me that in order for cosmopolitanism to have that depth, you have to show it to be a tribe. You have to make it into a tribe. You have to show its narrative and its education and how people become tribalists as cosmopolitans. And this is a question I've asked you before. What's the flag for cosmopolitanism? What's the depth? What's the story? What is it that is going to allow a cosmopolitan to transform into a cosmopolitan? And you want to say, well, there's no transformation. It's just take him as he is. But then I don't see I don't see the depth. And so I'll leave it there.
I was recently reading an article by the late Richard Rorty, who, as some of you may know, was a great philosopher. And in this article, he narrates having lunch with his son and one of his nephews. This was after Dick Rorty had been diagnosed with inoperable pancreatic cancer. So the Baptist says, has this diagnosis led you to read about religion or God? And his son, Rorty's son, said, has this led you to read more philosophy? And Rorty said, neither. I'm not reading about God or philosophy. So one asks, so what are you reading? And Rorty says, I'm reading poetry. And I wish I remembered more poetry. As I leave this world, my regret is that I remember less poetry. And that's a form of living that I think has depth to it. It doesn't require a flag. I mean, some of the deepest people I know.
Okay, but you don't have to be a cosmopolitan to read poetry.
Yeah, but I thought what you were saying was that to have depth, you have to be a member of a tribe.
I think the next panel is going to be on poetry, so this is a great segue. I'm trying to think how.
While you're formulating your thought, I mean, let me say this, that I don't think everything is equal in my life. My family clearly matters more to me. But I don't think of that as a kind of tribal significance. I think of that as people who matter to me because I've known them all through my life, because they've helped me in these critical moments in my life. Similarly, my home, my ancestral home, I don't think the richness that it gives me or the comfort that it gives me has anything to do with my being or not being a member of a tribe. You know, it's a place I've lived in or have strong associations with from as far back as I can remember.
But so, I mean, I love the poetry question, and part of me thinks, I wonder how one, and I'm eager to hear what Ann Lauterbach and Zoe Hitzik have to say about this, but to what extent one writes poems as a member of a tribe or as a cosmopolitan. To read a poem, right, and to seek out a past or a story or something. I mean, you're not reading a poem written by AI, at least not yet. You know, it comes out of a tradition. It comes out of a history. Or at least that's how I would imagine it. I mean, Chopin is not music. It's classical Western music.
But what if it weren't? I don't know about that tradition. I just listen to Chopin.
Yeah.
I find his work moving. It's what gives me a sense of something inside of me.
What keeps coming to mind is, like, you know, the person who goes and eats in a Middle Eastern restaurant versus Lawrence of Arabia, right? Or Burton, what's his name, Richard Burton, who was the first Westerner to go on a Hajj, right? And, you know, if you read Anthony Appiah's work, and you know, he talks about Richard Burton, and he says that's a real cosmopolitan because they're actually going to learn to become and embrace, and so much so that it's not clear whether Richard Burton, you know, where his loyalties lie anymore. And so I guess there's a part of me that still, you know, that I think to love Indian poetry, you have to learn a little bit about India, but maybe I'm wrong.
Now you're talking about something I know very little about. I don't know anything about Indian poetry. All I know about is Western poetry, Western music, and that also classical, to the great embarrassment of my daughter, who would like to expand my repertoire. But in any case, the point is, I don't think depth comes from being tribal.
Okay, I'm gonna wonder if anyone here has thoughts or questions for us, because we only have about 10 minutes in this, and I'd like to, Uday and I are going to have many more walks, and we can pursue this. Right here in the front.
Which one?
Yes, in the black shirt.
I found the idea you proposed of there being a difference between a tribe and a tradition and simply familiarity. Like how you said you grew up, you know, with those Indian traditions, but you don't view that like as something you would die for, as like your, you know, like it is something you're a part of, as like something you were born into, but not your tribe as you would describe it. And you know, my family are Liberian immigrants, and you know, I know those Liberian flavors, you know, those smells, those things, yeah. And you know, I know a little bit of the history, but I wouldn't say that like I, you know, would die for the country of Liberia, but I would die for my family, or I would, you know, live for my family. And I think of those as, you know, my familiarities, my traditions, but not in the sort of tribal sense of that being, you know, the idea of the group as what is important to me, but the actual members of it. So I just wanted to ask you, what do you define as the line between a tribe, a tradition, and a familiarity?
Look, each of these things can produce depth. One can have a deep investment in tribal identity, just like one can have a deep investment in familiarity, just like one can have a deep investment in a kind of tradition. I think the point is to have a rich kind of existence. And I think cosmopolitanism gives you a kind of richness. It doesn't necessitate a richness. Just like it doesn't necessitate travel. Villagers can have very rich lives. Villagers who don't speak any, who are illiterate, can have very cosmopolitan lives, even though they haven't traveled outside their village. That is the world I want to live in. That's, for me, a healthy world. Does that answer your question?
Well, let's move on, because we only have about a couple minutes. Is that Jess? I can't even see. Yeah, Jess. Yeah. Can you bring a mic up?
Oh, sure.
Thank you so much for this talk. You're bringing together the concepts of the covenant and the contract, brought to mind the work of your late colleague Charles Mills, The Racial Contract, where, and it struck me listening to you that he might be inviting people who see their racial identity as in terms of a kind of covenant, to think of it as a sort of contract that they might divest from. At the same time, of course, it might turn out that their investment, say, in whiteness is in their interests, as W.E.B. Du Bois talks about whiteness in terms of a public and psychological wage. So I wonder how you think about this problem, that these identities that might be covenants could turn into more sort of interest-based contractual ones, and they remain a kind of problem and perhaps are anti-liberal or anti-cosmopolitan.
Yeah, yeah. Even though I admire Charles Mill's work, his office and my office were beside each other. I think I think you're right that he felt that there was something about the contract, the liberal contract, that in its liberal form implicitly was a racial contract. My point is different. My point is contracts per se. Charles's point was there is something about the liberal contract that is dishonest because it actually professes to be universal when in fact it is about white people. I think he may have been right. Just like Carol Pateman's work, I think she makes a very important point in her reading of Locke. I think she comes close to saying Locke believed in rape because he doesn't challenge the inequality between men and women. That's different. That's not the level at which I'm talking about contract. Those are specific articulations of contract.
Yeah, right down here.
Thank you. I have been thinking about this question of poetry, and it made me think yesterday of Thomas Chatterton Williams's comment about reading Dostoevsky and that sense of touching the human condition and those deep human questions. I think about Azar Nafisi's reading Lolita in Tehran and the transformative power of bringing that literature there. I happen to work for a Jewish organization. It's secular. It's called the Worker Circle, the Arbiter Ring. And we have this phrase, Jewish culture for a just world, which seems to me to bridge the divide a bit because one doesn't have to be Jewish in order to appreciate it, right? Or to draw upon it or its values. I'm wondering if you might talk a little bit about how the arts, how cultures can be offerings to cosmopolitanism or invitations to that.
So I can't do better than what Thomas did yesterday. Here was reading a book by a 19th century Russian novelist that he said transformed his life. That it got rid of, let's just call it, his tribalism. I find that to be a very moving example, but not unexceptional. I think certain forms of poetry, novels have transformed my life. I used to be a fanatic about First World War poetry. And I remember reading Hardy's poem, I can't remember the poem's name.
Hardy's poem.
Hardy's poem. Any case, that was a transformative moment for me. I was in school and I read this poem and it meant something to me. It would be an exaggeration to say it changed my life, but it certainly changed my intellectual orientation. It made my life richer.
Might it be a bridge to justice, though? Like toward a cosmopolitan view beyond the individual?
Yeah.
It's not an accident that in a conference on tribalism and cosmopolitanism, we decided to have the last panel on poetry. And it is an accident that we ended up talking about it as a lead-in to it, which I love, those kind of happy accidents. So as we welcome up Alison Stenger, Zoe Hitzig, and Lauterbach, please join me in thanking Uday Mehta.